Evan Hawkins is a Buffalo artist who has a current installation here at Hallwalls. This moonscape behind me is a rather severe build out that blocks out about 75% of the gallery physically and creates a passage around the space by which people can engage with the work, and some portholes through which you can see behind the work, and some other portholes by which you can see into another space. So he's dealing with real space, gallery space, fictional space, and imaginary space. There are a lot of tangents to the work. It functions in a lot of different ways. The wall beside me is a vertical plane, and if we went around the corner, we would see a horizontal plane. And materials are convincing, yet they're not trying to be too convincing. We know that it's an installation. It's giving itself away many times that it's an installation, but it hovers in that space between convincing reality and apparent falsehood or obvious falsehood. And so this is sort of a weird moment where we don't have an audience for an artist talk, but we wanted to do one nonetheless. So please enjoy this artist talk by Evan Hawkins.
First off, before I start talking about my work, I just wanted to take a second and thank specifically John Massier for, allowing me to put this show up. I feel like it was a long time coming. This is sort of like the second rendition of this show, and so it's nice to see it in a venue that I think works really well with the work, and so I really appreciate it. And I'd also like to just quickly thank Kyle Butler and Rebecca Wing for helping with the installation. And also, I can't forget to mention my wife, Megan, who just puts up with my crap and makes these things possible without me losing my mind. So, without further ado. All right, so I'm starting off with what work that feels like it was ages ago, but actually, this is work from my BFA show at UB. And it was only almost 10 years ago. It was May of 2011, so we're coming up on 10 years right now, which kind of dates me here. But when I was very young, I was super into architecture, and a lot of my, what I consider earlier work revolves around architecture. And this series started with combining specifically industry and a lot of architecture from Buffalo with Mayan architecture. And I kind of stumbled upon this body of work, and it really ignited a passion in my work that hadn't been there at all. I remember having conversations with some of my professors, and they were telling me, "You're talented, but where's your passion? Why are you doing this?" And, it's funny because I felt like I was doing it because I was good, not because I wanted to. And having those conversations actually helped drive me towards really wanting to make the work. So that's just a small segue into how I started to make work that I began to care about. So this was the first series I did that I really, truly felt driven to make. And that's why I'm showing it. So a lot of these buildings are specifically Buffalo. This is City Hall to anybody who's familiar with it. And it's superimposed on, one of the temples from Mexico, specifically Mayan. And I did dozens of these prints. This one was a little bit later, and I was using the Darwin Martin house as like a focal point. And, these are mostly lithographs, and I was really into printmaking at the time. That was my focus, and I think the process of it really lent itself to these images. And anybody who knows printmaking knows that it's very process oriented. It's very methodical. You have to plan things out, and that really fit in with my personality. So this one's a little bit more straightforward. I actually originally had intended to be an architect, and it was after I got into the beginning of the architecture program at UB that I just realized very quickly it was a little bit too rigid for my personality, and I very quickly decided that even though I had maybe the aptitude for it, I didn't have the desire to be an architect. So I felt like art was a good way to sort of cheat the logistics of it. Like, you don't have to make any of this stuff real. You just, essentially replicate. This work began after I got out of school, and I started doing these. I no longer had access to printmaking facilities, so I just went back to what I know. I went back to drawing, and I started doing these drawings on aluminum, graphite on aluminum, and I sort of started to expand a little bit on some of the visual references. So I really got interested in tombs specifically, so I started looking at different tombs from all over the world and juxtaposing them with sort of urban decay specifically. So this is the train terminal in Detroit, which I don't know what it's doing right now, but it was abandoned for decades, kind of like the one in Buffalo. And so they're kind of like these. I mean, it's a little heavy-handed, some of the imagery, but this was where my mind was at. Sort of similar to the work before it. I kind of had this. I sometimes have a little bit of fatalistic view on humanity, and so a lot of it comes out through my work, sometimes more in more subtle ways than others. But a lot of these are, very monolithic, sort of inspired with collage in some ways, whether it's through Photoshop or physical collage, taking disparate images and combining them to make something, sort of fantastic. And that's a theme that pretty much shows up in the majority of my work. So this one might be a little bit harder to decipher, but it's Manhattan coming out of this sort of monolith. And generally the way I work is I kind of exhaust ideas. Not just for myself, but like I'll keep working an idea that I'm interested in to the point where it no longer interests me almost. So I'm only showing like a small segment of these series of works, but it almost becomes obsessive to the point of I don't even sometimes know what's objectively good or not. I just keep creating stuff until I kind of feel exhausted, and then sometimes because of that, I'll start to explore those ideas in other ways. So this image is sort of an example of that. After drawing for so long, eventually I think my mind just needs some kind of break. So, maybe I start working on sculptures. So, I mean, thematically, this piece in particular is I think tied to a lot of that a lot of those same tropes. You know, you have this image of what looks like maybe an abandoned settlement, and these are actually pieces of driftwood that have been carved to look like small cities. And this is like one of the earliest things I did once I was in grad school, and some of the work I was doing was, I think, reflective of the change in my life, quite literally, like moving out of state and being away from family for the first time and feeling a little bit isolated. And, you know, once again, maybe a little heavy-handed piece of driftwood with a small city on it, sort of floating. But this is where my mind was sort of, you know, resting at the moment. I felt like I needed to focus in on something small, and it's kind of, anybody who's ever made something that's like a model, it's kind of, it's almost like it's a little precious. Like you have to be very careful and methodical, and you have to plan things out, and it kind of focuses your, I don't know, all your energy into something that's very contained. And then back to, you know, drawing again. So this is something that, you know, happens a lot in my work. I kind of bounce between media. So this is a lithograph. So trying to see which media is going to be the strongest way of representing an idea. So there's actually supposed to be an image of this as a photograph, but I guess it didn't make the cut. Anyway, so all this work is sequential. So right after working on these like very small pieces, and you know, I just felt the urge to make something of larger scale and more, you know, more experiential, I guess. So this was sort of, it was meant to be calling into your mind like the ideas of being imprisoned to some extent. You know, there's cameras on these structures, and you know, you can't come into contact with the gallery walls. I mean, you could step through the rope. It wasn't actually going to stop you, but you know, people understand that in an art exhibition, generally, you're not supposed to do those kind of things. So kind of the idea of keeping people away from what they're supposed to be in contact with. And that was an idea that kind of intrigued me, like keeping people away from the gallery in some way. Oh, here we go. Here's that other image. So this was I photographed the piece and put it on a lake that was actually, I took a photograph of the lake that was outside, and kind of, you know, like I said, just trying different ways of working with the same content and seeing which way is going to be the most successful representation. And then the architecture thing kind of comes back into play. So these are all laser cut buildings that I designed, and they're just thin sheets of paper that had to be glued and assembled and gridded out. And these are the kind of things that, like, when you work on stuff like this, or at least this is how I approach it, it probably took me 200 hours to put all these buildings together, and it's all done on a tabletop, and then it just you get to the end of it, and personally, I just need to do something radically different. I need to use a different part of my brain. And so this piece is where the work for the show that's up right now sort of started. So I didn't assemble this ship. I found this ship, and I just simply destroyed it. And where the idea came from was, a lot of the inspiration for my work just honestly comes from appropriation. So whether it's a book or, just surfing Google or whatever, I find images that intrigue me. And I think I stumbled upon an image of like a ship on the bottom of the ocean. And it sort of intrigued me the way that the silt and the sort of detritus had caked up on it, and it just turned into this homogeneous image. I mean, like you almost couldn't tell what the thing was. And so it wasn't until I took this piece and put it up on the wall that formally I realized there was like some similarities between the different scapes of, like specifically the moon and the bottom of the ocean. And it seems kind of like a ridiculous idea, but I didn't let it really deter me from exploring it. So, I started thinking about some of the similarities and the differences between like those two very different places. Lack of oxygen, sound and light deprivation, extremes in pressure, high pressure, low pressure, specialized craft to get there, usually a 2-man crew. Even like the influence that the moon has on the tides. Like it seemed a little bit too, there were too many connections not to want to explore it further. So this is a photograph of that ship superimposed on slides from the Apollo missions. And like going back, trying to explore different ways of representing something. So in this case, I decided that, maybe photographs were the best thing to do. So I started using, mostly found images and superimposing them on these slides from NASA, which conveniently they had just released something like 8,000 photos from the Apollo missions, and they were very high resolution and free. So I just sifted through them. I went through those images like at least three times, and found images that I thought would work well with some of the imagery that I wanted to use. So a lot of it is, ships, transportation, and a lot of it that is not imaged in these is almost has more to do with colonization and to some extent imperialism. Tanks and Apache helicopters and more vehicles of war, which I think comes into mind with some of the stuff that's happening now with, all these nations trying to, go to Mars at the same time, or renewed interest in the moon. It's like, who owns it? Who's going to get there first? Who's going to plant the flag? And so a lot of these themes, I think, I don't know, I'm just very enamored with them. And so back to drawing here, just trying different ways of representing the same theme, essentially. And then I started exploring these pieces in a more literal sense, trying to create not a facsimile of it, of like a lunar surface, but something that would give the illusion, I guess, of a space that most people will never ever come into contact with. And I also was playing around with like people's expectations, reality and perspective. I don't know the full story, but there's this story about, people in a cave, like chained to the wall, and there's a fire behind them, and they see their shadows on the wall, but they can't see anything else. They can't see the fire, and they can't see outside of the cave, and they can't even see each other. All they can see is the shadows being projected. And to them, that's reality, but in reality, there's a whole other world out there behind them, and they just don't know about it. So a lot of this work ended up kind of feeding into that idea that, your perspective on something is not necessarily what is representative of reality. So, these are just thin layers of grout over top of foam, and when you look at them dead on, they may appear to be sort of hulking and somewhat substantial pieces, but then you peer around the side of them and they're very clearly foam. So, and then you have these vertical lines going through them that also kind of break up that illusion. So I kind of took it a little bit further with scale and trying to encompass people's peripheral vision, I guess, like being encompassed by it and getting more of a, once again, like a different perspective on it. Like, so eventually this sort of led to the idea of coming up with an installation where you would see out onto the lunar surface in a space that was approximately the same dimensions and geometry as the module that landed on the moon. And once again, I was enamored by the idea that you would never come into contact with the gallery. In some ways, I was trying to deny people that experience. So you walked through this door and down the tunnel into the module, and you saw out of these windows into dioramas that were the moon. And like, as I said, for me, at the time, it was very important that people did not come into contact with the gallery. So even the floor was covered. So in some ways, it was it was denying the viewer of the typical experience of the gallery. And they never came into contact with the outside of the installation. They didn't know what the other side looked like. This was it. So and when I was done with that exhibition, I once again kind of returned to some what I think are different ways of thinking. Grad school for me, this is all work from grad school. Grad school for me was just a chance to fail. So I tried all sorts of things, and there's a lot of stuff in here that I don't think necessarily is my most successful work, but I think it's a good representation of where my mind has been in the last few years. And so a lot of the work ends up being about, I think, illusion. Like this photograph doesn't necessarily give you the same feel of what it was like to see this piece in the round. It actually created more of almost like the heat waves that you see coming off of the road on a hot day, where you get that sort of illusion of the space above. And it is kind of just a bizarre thing to see out in this big green space. And like I said, I like occasionally stepping outside of those comfort zones of what what you're confident that you're good at, and accepting that it might be a failure. And actually, for what it's worth, this thing got vandalized really heavily, actually. It was Mother's Day weekend, and everybody flocked outside, and this was foam covered in foil, and almost every square inch of this got just completely vandalized. So back inside again, I really, after doing the installation about the moon and looking into conspiracy theories, especially the ones surrounding Stanley Kubrick, I started looking into the ways that people thought he might have faked the moon landing, and one of them was a technique he used in 2001: A Space Odyssey, where he used retroreflective materials behind a set, like a constructed set, and he took film slides and projected them onto that across the set, and it created some kind of odd lighting effect. So this is like a really crude version of that, where I created a small set and then projected film slides onto a backdrop behind the set. And they were just attempts at, sort of making a space that I couldn't create at scale. And I don't necessarily think these are the most successful pieces, but once again, these are just ways of like kind of showing different ways of approaching, or the different ways I've approached ideas and how to represent them. And this one was a small diorama that I had made, intending that the viewer wouldn't see it. I was going to film a small video on this one, but I kind of ended up I wasn't quite as driven to make this kind of work as I thought I should be. And so I ended up kind of eventually just returning back to drawing after doing some more like experimentation. So, a lot of these were like one-offs. I just did small pieces like architectural, making forms and just making these, simulated pieces. I mean, this is very similar to the panels that look like the moon. They're thin layers of grout on top of foam, and they look pretty convincing from the front, and if you see them from the side, it's very clear that they're not these hulking structures. They're sort of smoke and mirrors. And right as I was gearing up for my MFA, and I was kind of going through all these ideas that I wasn't particularly driven by, I think I was driving home from Wisconsin. It was like an 11-hour drive, and for some reason I had this fleeting thought about something that happened when I was very young, where my father took me and my sister to a public pool, and I nearly drowned, and it was probably one of my earliest memories, and I remember a lot of it in pretty vivid detail, but it was just a very strange thing that happened, and I never really gave much thought to it. And so for the first time, I kind of decided to think about it, like in as much detail as I could. And so I started making pieces that had to do with kind of specifically what I could remember and the pool itself. So this is like pretty close to the dimensions and the shape of the pool that it actually happened in. And this is just a sculpture with some pretty low-tech techniques, but it kind of led to doing a lot of drawings that had to do with what happened and how I kind of processed it. So, this image is representing, I don't want to sound too sacrilegious here, but it's based on a sculpture of Christ after he was taken off the cross. And I didn't want to take it too literally. I was 4 or 5 when this happened, but I depicted myself as I was when I drew the image. And I kind of I still haven't necessarily processed all of this work completely, but I thought there was enough there that it wasn't just like navel gazing. There's a lot of questions about mortality and about, to me, in some ways, religion, and whether you subscribe to it or not, just some of the bizarre nature of things like that when they happen, like how people cope, like if it had gone another way, if a small child drowns in a pool, and what do people do to move past it, if they even can. And so it wasn't necessarily like reliving trauma or anything. It was just interesting to me on a conceptual sort of level. And so when this happened, my father was in a chair sort of like this one reading a newspaper. And that's why he didn't see me go into the pool. And so if these two images kind of work together, the body sort of is reclined in that position like the chair. And so there's some I don't know, projection of sorts, like trying to get in somebody else's mindset and knowing maybe what they were thinking. But so these images I think they're pretty straightforward in most cases. Like on their own, they don't necessarily tell any story, but together they kind of add up to a loose narrative about what could have happened. And this is just like a small sample of what was actually in the body of work. But the reason this almost happened was I couldn't swim, and I had arm floats, and one of them had a hole in it, and I didn't want to wear it because I remember jumping in the pool and being sort of like floating there with half my body up at the water level and the other half of my body below the water level because one float was inflated and the other one wasn't. So, I asked my father if I could take it off, and he said, sure, just don't go in the deep end. And of course, being a kid, that's the first thing I did. As soon as I took those floats off, it went over into the deep end. So, and then this is probably the only thing from the show that wasn't specifically part of my memory. And it was more of like the logical part of my mind saying that, well, it's a pool, so it must have a drain. It must have some kind of circulation system. So I thought that making something more sculptural, something that would anchor the work, make it somewhat less ethereal, would be a good direction to head in. So to me, there's like sort of a ebb and flow. Like I work on stuff that's very methodical and contemplative, and I guess as precise as I can make it. And then I kind of have not a relapse, but I need to use a different part of my brain. So, return to the outside and make something of scale and, different thematically. Just, take a breather. And then once I've had that, and I return to, I guess, my first passion, which, I always go back to drawing. So, and I think after doing that work about the pool, I was still really interested in those ideas of like sort of a seemingly meaningless mortality. just like these simple acts that, end up being fatal. And it sounds pretty dark, but I wasn't thinking about it specifically because it was dark. I just was intrigued by the idea that you could be doing something so, something people do every day, just commuting, and you take your eyes off the road and you end up in a body of water, and that's it. So I was really intrigued by that, and I never really was explicit about it. It's just kind of these images of cars mostly that are, floating. You don't see any sign that something nefarious happened. It's just kind of implied. And that started growing out into like more accidents in general. There's just something. It's like, people who gawk at the side of the road. It's like, there's an accident somewhere and people slow down and look. It's just something that's like, I don't know, part of human nature. So, I mean, most of these images are, heavily appropriated. It wasn't really so important where they're coming from, or, obviously I stuck more with like that nocturnal look, and sort of very gloomy black and white. Black and white is like heavily used in my work. I'm sure you've probably noticed by now. It's actually kind of funny. When I was in undergrad, one of my teachers made us do work in black and white, and I hated every second of it. And I could not wait to move on to color. I thought it was such a unbelievable waste of time to do work in black and white. And years later, I essentially never even go near a colored palette. I don't know, it's more than a little ironic. And this one was a little bit of a divergence. This one was like, being stuck in the snow. And, there was just that big storm in Texas, and, people die like this. And it's kind of, I don't know, it's just, it's very bizarre to me that this kind of thing still happens, that people end up going in this manner. But I don't know, it's just, like I said, it just intrigues me. It's not about like, being all gloom and doom. It's just, I find it sort of bizarre and intriguing. And this piece, these are the last couple of slides of this talk. This piece was installed out in Medina a couple of years ago, and I got really interested in. I mean, this is still sort of in that terrain of lunarscapes, and it's not quite as easy to pick up on that as some of the other work, but really the only indicator is this small lifeboat in a crater. And it's funny, talking to people in the room, they picked up on it almost immediately just because of that one move. Even I remember this young kid came in, he must have been 7 or 8. He said, "It's the moon, isn't it?" And I just thought that was funny because it's so, a lot of it is so illogical. And I tend to think of myself as a pretty logical person, and art is really the only place where I can be illogical and not have a problem with it. And I think that's part of why, I mean, it's subjective. You could think my work is good or not, but I think that's what makes some of my work successful, is that I can break from that strictly logical part of my brain from time to time and make something that has no business being and, you know, existing in reality. So, you know, and I remember talking to John about this too, like, yeah, it's just, in some ways it's, you know, it might sound a little bit like a, I don't want to say it's catharsis, but it is sort of in that realm where it's a way of, I don't know, decompressing from the mundane of what actually becomes your everyday life. I mean, yeah. But that's the last of the images on that cheerful, lovely note. And I don't know if we do questions at some point through a digital forum, but I'll be happy to answer anything that people want to know about if they have questions.